Throughout Magic's history, there have been countless cards that have, through one way or another, created an infinite combo. While there are plenty of cards that have only very niche combos, there exist several cards that have proven to be the source of several different ways to go infinite. While infinite loops may not be the most common in competitive Magic, there are several cards notorious for causing them that have become infamous within the community. Starting us off at number 10, we have Palinchron. This illusion creature costs 5 generic mana and 2 blue. It has 4 power, 5 toughness, and whenever it enters the battlefield, you untap up to 7 lands. It also has the ability for you to pay 2 generic and 2 blue mana to return Palinchron to your hand. The enters the battlefield effect of Palinchron essentially pays for itself, with an untapping the 7 lands necessary to cast Palinchron under most normal circumstances. But part of what makes Palinchron so easily broken is that it's very easy to abuse Palintron's untapping ability. If your lands tap for more than 1 mana, such as High Tide makes your islands tap for an extra blue, Palintron can net you extra mana whenever it enters the battlefield. This, alongside its other ability, means you can pay 4 of that extra mana to put Palintron back in your hand. Then from there, you're allowed to cast Palintron again, untapping the lands and repeating the process. Even without a dedicated spell like High Tide, Palintron can also go infinite with a land like Cabal Coffers that produces enough mana by itself. Although you don't even need to have your lands produce extra mana at all if you want to make your Palintron leave and enter the battlefield repeatedly. One common method is using Deadeye Navigator's Soulbond ability to give Palintron the ability to exile itself, then return to the battlefield immediately. This activate ability only costs 1 generic and 1 blue mana, meaning if Palintron is on the battlefield already, you can go infinite with as little as 2 available mana. Since you can, from there, tap all of your lands in response to the Palintron ability, then untap them, floating the mana, and as much as you'd like from there. Palintron combos are fairly efficient terms of getting to infinite mana. However, in sanctioned formats, Palintron tends to be just a bit too slow compared to other options. And also, it's generally better to go for an infinite combo that wins the game itself, as opposed to one that just gives you infinite mana. Since without an outlet for that mana, you don't have much of anything to do from there. That's partly why Palintron has been so successful in the commander format historically. Since you can have a legendary creature in the command zone, you can choose a commander with an activated ability that costs mana that you can then activate repeatedly with your infinite mana to win the game. Other formats lack this built-in combo potential, which is why Palintron mainly lives in the commander, and why it's only the 10th spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Necrotic Ooze. The Ooze costs 2 generic and 2 black mana, as well as having 4 power and 3 toughness. As long as it's on the battlefield, it has the activated abilities of all creatures in all graveyards. This ability means you have access to just about any ability in the game, meaning an ability that's normally on a creature that is difficult to cast can be used much earlier than anticipated in the pace of a game. But even more important is that as long as you can find ways to put the right cards in the graveyard, Necrotic Ooze can often win the game on the spot by combining the abilities of multiple different creatures. One of the most common ways of doing this is via the creature Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker, a card which has the ability to create a token copy of any non-legendary creature by tapping itself. That token has the keyword haste, meaning it can attack or be tapped this turn. Normally, Kiki-Jiki's ability cannot be used on itself, and thus it cannot go infinite quite so easily. But since Necrotic Ooze isn't legendary, it can target itself freely, thus making infinite copies of Ooze. While the tokens will be sacrificed at the next end step, you can combine them with a variety of other abilities to end the game, such as using the ability Death Cultist to sacrifice all the tokens and drain your opponent's life. Necrotic Ooze can also be used alongside Phyrexian Devour to exile cards from your library and give itself counters, only to then remove those counters using the ability of Triskelion to deal enough damage to win. Essentially, any creature combo that exists entirely through creature activated abilities is a combo that exists through Necrotic Ooze. It requires graveyard setup, but Necrotic Ooze goes infinite in more ways than most cards given the nature of combining abilities that were not designed to be on the same creature. It also allows you to do these combos much earlier than if you had played out the normal combo, since Necrotic Ooze only has a mana value of 4 and has all of those abilities right out the gate as long as they're in the right spot. The amount of setup required does leave it susceptible to graveyard hate to a point where it has not seen play much in sanctioned competitive formats. And at number 8, we have Isochron Scepter. This artifact costs 2 generic mana, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile an instant card with a mana value 2 or less from your hand. You may pay 2 generic mana and tap Isochron Scepter to copy the exiled card and cast the copy without paying the mana cost. In essence, this allows you to exile a low mana value spell from your hand to have it repeatedly usable thanks to Scepter. While this could be used alongside something like Interaction or a Search effect to repeatedly get value out of the spell, it's most commonly used as the centerpiece of infinite mana combos. If you make Isochron Scepter a creature, you can exile a spell that untaps all creatures you control to also untap the Scepter in the process. As long as you then have enough creatures to tap for mana, you can then continue tapping the Scepter and generating that mana. If the spell exiled with Isochron Scepter is Benefactor's Drought, you'll be able to draw a card every time you do this, eventually allowing you to draw your entire deck. However, this and other setups are somewhat convoluted compared to the most simple combo that Isochron Scepter has. Dramatic Reversal is an instant that costs 1 in blue and untaps all non-land permanents you control. While a spell like Benefactor's Draught requires you to set things up further, Dramatic Reversal is already able to untap the Scepter by default. Beyond this, you can also rely on mana-producing artifacts alongside creatures, meaning it's far easier to generate your infinite mana. One of the major drawbacks of the combo is that if the Scepter is ever destroyed, this spell will remain in exile, meaning you'll have to find another copy of it to combo again. And considering this is another combo that primarily sees playing Commander, it does hold it back some. However, the Dramatic Scepter combo is a potent and well-known combo in competitive Commander despite its frailty. There are plenty of spells that can search Dramatic Reversal, and given that these decks often run various combos, Isochron Scepter can sometimes be used instead as an outlet for a different combo, or if necessary for value when the combo is outright undoable and options are limited. And at number 7, we have Cloudstone Curio. This artifact costs 3 generic mana and has the ability that whenever a non-artifact permanent enters a battlefield under your control, you may return another permanent you control that shares a type with it to its owner's hand. This card generally allows the player to reuse powerful enter the battlefield or leaves the battlefield effects while cycling through their own creatures. However, when combined with 2 creatures that cost 0 mana, then Curio could bounce those 2 creatures indefinitely, since you can just keep recasting them for free and triggering Curio again. Combined with an Impact Tremors effect that deals damage whenever a creature enters the battlefield, it's an efficient on mana, if heavy on cards, win condition. However, the card's combo potential doesn't end there, especially since Cloudstone Curio does not specify it has to be a non-token permanent that enters the battlefield. As such, if you have a creature like Alayla, Artful Provocateur, it allows you to use 0 mana artifact creatures, which normally would not work with Cloudstone Curio given its non-artifact restriction. Alayla creates a creature token whenever an artifact enters the battlefield. So while Memnite would not trigger the Cloudstone Curio, the creature token Alayla makes would. Then you can use that trigger to bounce the Memnite since it shares a creature type, and then recast it and repeat the process. Of course, the most popular Cloudstone Curio combo in recent times has been Commander with the card Dockside Extortionist. This goblin creates a treasure token when it enters the battlefield for each artifact and enchantment your opponent controls. These creature tokens can be tapped and sacrificed to add 1 mana of any color, which means as long as Dockside can make enough treasures to cast another cheap creature in your hand, you can then repeatedly bounce 2 cards with Curio to eventually generate infinite treasure tokens. Cloudstone Curio is perhaps one of the least concise cards of this list, since it inherently requires you to have at least 3 cards for it to do anything, and sometimes even needs a 4th to win the game with it. However, there's a good bit of redundancy in Cloudstone Curio's best combos, and while you're waiting to draw the combo pieces, it remains a much more valuable card throughout the course of a regular game, as opposed to more wholly dedicated and niche combo pieces. And at number 6, we have Basalt Monolith. This artifact costs 3 generic mana and has a drawback of not untapping during your untap. You can tap it to add 3 colorless mana to your mana pool, and at any time you may pay 3 mana to untap Basalt Monolith. The original design intent for the card is to be something of a reserve source of mana to help you skip ahead to cast key spells. You save it until you have a high mana value spell you need to cast, then whenever you have the extra mana on a following turn, you can spend it to untap the Monolith to use it later. However, seeing how Basalt Monolith generates 3 mana and it costs the same amount of mana to untap it, this already means you can functionally tap and untap the Monolith infinite times without even any other cards needing to be on board to help you. This doesn't net you any mana, but if you have a card such as Mesmeric Orb, which mills you 1 card every time you untap a permanent, then suddenly Basalt Monolith can put your entire deck into your graveyard, or at least go until you hit a specific card you're aiming for. This is merely the surface, however, with Basalt Monolith, as there are several cards that allow you to tip one of its abilities over the line and make the card generate infinite mana itself. Forsaken Monument is a card which generates an additional colorless mana whenever you tap a permanent for colorless mana. This means whenever you tap Basalt Monolith for 3 mana, you also gained 1 mana for Forsaken Monument. This allows Basalt Monolith's infinite tapping and untapping to net you infinite colorless mana. This can also be achieved through copying the untap ability, such as with the card Rings of Brighthearth. If you activate the ability to untap Basalt Monolith, then copy it by paying 2 generic mana with the Rings of Brighthearth, you can tap the Basalt Monolith for mana in response to each untap trigger. As such, you'll generate enough mana to activate the untap ability and the ability of Rings again, generating infinite mana once more. Zerdra the Dawnwalker was banned in Legacy format thanks to its ability to make activated abilities cost 2 less generic mana to activate. This too allows Basalt Monolith to go infinite because now it only costs 1 generic mana to untap Monolith, and as such you'll net 2 mana each time you tap and untap it. Basalt Monolith is so easy to combo with because it has very little room for its ability to be fair. If you offset the mana cost or the mana generated by even 1, then suddenly Basalt Monolith can go infinite. The card Grim Monolith also has similar combos, although its untap ability costs 4 generic mana, and as such is less consistent for the sake of comboing off. Basalt Monolith is a card that will continue to find new combos as new cards that manipulate mana production or interact with activated abilities continue to be printed. And at number 5, we have Ghostly Flicker. This instant spell costs 2 generic and 1 blue mana, and has the effect of exiling 2 target artifacts, creatures, and or lands you control, then return those cards to the battlefield under your control. At surface level, this might seem unassuming, since there are plenty of spells and abilities that can flicker a permanent like this. Part of it comes from the fact that Ghostly Flicker is able to choose 2 permanents, but what makes it really ripe for comboing is its ability to target permanents of different types, and especially lands for the sake of comboing. The most simple Ghostly Flicker combo includes using a card like Dualcaster Mage to copy Ghostly Flicker. Then you can target Dualcaster Mage in any land to then flicker them. When Dualcaster Mage re-enters, it can copy Ghostly Flicker again, and you can have an untapped land you can use to float mana with. The card also goes infinite with Peregrine Drake alongside a permanent that can return a spell from the graveyard to the hand, like the creature Archaeomancer. The Archaeomancer will put Ghostly Flicker back in your hand, and the Peregrine Drake will untap enough lands to both recast the Ghostly Flicker, but also net mana as well. Part of the value of Ghostly Flicker as a combo tool is that it's so easy to win with. In the case of Dualcaster Mage, or a similar card to it, the second card you flicker can be literally anything. So if you have a creature that draws a card when it enters, or deals damage when it leaves, or so on and so on, you can win on the spot by landed enter and leave the battlefield as many times as needed. Since Ghostly Flicker can affect lands, it allows you to get infinite landfall triggers as well, and even opens up synergies with the land Mystic Sanctuary, which will put the Ghostly Flicker back on top of your deck. You can then draw it and reuse it, or take the route of using a card like Future Sight to play it off the top of your deck. And even beyond all this, throughout the course of the game, Ghostly Flicker is a relevant card. It can be used to save a creature from removal or getting some more value from those abilities, meaning in the games where you haven't drawn into the combo, it's still relevant and can help you survive. Ghostly Flicker sees play in the Pauper format both in value-oriented decks as well as the occasional combo shell. And at number 4 on this list, we have Heliod, Uncrowned. This legendary enchantment creature is a god that costs 2 generic and 1 white mana. It has 5 power and 5 toughness, as well as the keyword ability Indestructible. This essentially means Heliod cannot be destroyed directly or dealt enough damage to kill it. In fact, as long as your devotion to white is less than 5, Heliod isn't even a creature at all, and is just an enchantment. Devotion is a total of colored mana symbols and cost amongst permanents you control. So in this case, including the 1 white devotion from Heliod itself, you will need 4 other white mana symbols on the battlefield for Heliod to be a creature. While this limits it from being an aggressive threat early in the game, this does offer it even more protection from targeted exile effects that could hit a creature. This is relevant given that Heliod is a central combo piece for many decks. His other 2 abilities are where this comes into play, with one stating that whenever you gain life, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or enchantment you control. You can also pay 1 generic and 1 white mana to give a creature lifelink, which means you gain life equal to the damage it deals. This synergizes with Heliod's ability to give counters, which is the central point of several infinite combos. One such combo is with the card Spike Feeder. It enters with 2 +1/+1 counters on it, and you can remove a +1/+1 counter from Spike Feeder to gain 2 life. When you do this, this triggers the effect of Heliod, which then allows you to put a +1/+1 counter onto Spike Feeder. This means you have gained 2 life and are exactly where you were at the beginning, meaning you can go and essentially gain as much life as you'd want. Of course, this by itself does not win the game, but it set the precedent for the sort of combos Heliod enables. In the modern format, Heliod most often combos with the card Walking Ballista, which enters with +1/+1 counters relative to the amount of mana spent to cast it, and you can remove a +1/+1 counter from it to deal 1 damage to any target. If you use Heliod's activated ability to then give the Walking Ballista lifelink, this allows for essentially the same loop as the Spike Feeder combo, where Walking Ballista deals 1 damage to opponent, and you gain 1 life thanks to lifelink. Then Heliod puts a new counter on Ballista to do it again. This combo has proven quite effective in the modern format alongside Collected Company, and has slotted into modern as one of the most dominant creature-based combo decks. And at number 3, we have Urza, Lord High Artificer. This legendary human artificer creature costs 2 generic and 2 blue mana. It has 1 power, 4 toughness, and whenever it enters the battlefield, you create a 0 power and toughness construct artifact creature token that gets +1 power and toughness for each artifact you control. Its other abilities allow you to tap an untapped artifact you control to add 1 blue mana, and then you may pay 5 generic mana to shuffle your library and then exile the top card. You may play that card without paying its mana cost until the end of turn. Urza provides both mana acceleration and a decent body in combat, but also a long-term value ability in the term of its mana sink effect. Artifact decks quickly congealed around the card in Modern around the time of its printing, centering on grindy value decks that won with multiple combo lines. One combo played especially frequently in early Urza decks was the combo between Thopter Foundry, which lets you pay 1 mana to sacrifice a non-token artifact to create a Thopter artifact creature token and gain 1 life, and the equipment card Sword of the Meek. Sword of the Meek will equip itself from the graveyard to a creature with 1 power and toughness whenever that creature enters the battlefield. This means that you can sacrifice the sword to Thopter Foundry and create the token, which would then trigger the sword to come back. With Urza in play, you could tap the sword for 1 blue mana to pay for the Thopter Foundry ability, allowing this already powerful loop to become infinite. netting you as many Thopters and as much life as you'd like. There were also combos available to Urza thanks to Master Thopterus, who creates Thopter tokens whenever you cast an artifact spell. Since Urza's mana ability is specifically on Urza himself, even though these Thopter tokens are all summoning sick, they can still be tapped with Urza to generate mana since they're artifacts. As such, using Psi alongside 0 mana cost artifacts and a card such as Hullbreaker Horror allows for you to go infinite in a loop similar to what Cloudstone Curio does. Even beyond these direct combo lines, given Urza's ability to play random cards off the top of the deck by just generating enough artifacts and spinning the wheels with Urza enough, sometimes you'll assemble one of the combo lines almost incidentally. Urza's mana sync ability is also fantastic alongside the card Paradox Engine, which will untap all your non-land permanents every time you cast a spell. This means as long as Urza doesn't hit a land with his ability, you will untap all your artifacts and be able to tap them to use Urza's ability again, allowing you to go until you hit a land again. Part of the strength of Urza decks has been the ability to run varying cards that synergize together and could snowball into various paths to victory, all on the back of Urza's effects. And at number 2, we have Vizier of Remedies. This human cleric costs 1 generic and 1 white mana and has 2 power and 1 toughness. Its ability is that if 1 or more -1/-1 counters would be put on a creature you control, you instead put 1 less than the original amount. So if an effect would put 2 -1/-1 counters on something, it would only put 1 counter. And if something would just put 1 counter on it, no counters are placed on it at all. This design was intended to protect your creatures from your opponent placing counters on them and killing them. However, it's specifically the interaction in which it prevents singular counters from being placed at all where the combo potential lies, thanks to some creatures having effects that give themselves a single counter. One such card is Kitchen Finks, which has the ability Persist, which means whenever it dies and did not have a -1/-1 counter on it, return to the battlefield with one of those counters on it. Thanks to Vizier of Remedies, Kitchen Finks would return but not be able to gain the -1/-1 counter. As such, as long as Vizier is on the battlefield, Kitchen Finks will return after dying, and since it gains 2 life whenever it enters the battlefield, if you have a way to sacrifice Kitchen Finks, you will then gain infinite life. This same interaction is true for every creature with Persist, meaning if used alongside Murderous Redcap, Vizier of Remedies can then kill your opponent by infinitely bringing back the Redcap. Although Vizier of Remedies is most relevant for its combo potential with the card Devoted Druid, which has almost as much potential for abuse with combos as Vizier of Remedies. Devoted Druid costs 1 generic and 1 green for an Elf Druid that can be tapped for 1 green mana. You may place a -1/-1 counter on Devoted Druid to untap it. Devoted Druid has 0 power and 2 toughness, so you're not meant to be able to use this ability very much at all. But thanks to Vizier of Remedies, the Druid will never get a counter on it in the first place. As such, these 2 creatures produce infinite green mana. Vizier of Remedies was chosen for the spot over its fellow combo piece because it has more versatility. Devoted Druid can only ever make infinite mana. But based on what creature you pair Vizier with, you could do anything from draw your entire library, or mill your opponent out with the sacrifice outlet like Altar of Dementia. And finally, the number 1 card for causing infinite combos is Aluren. This enchantment costs 2 generic and 2 green mana and allows any player to cast creature spells with mana value 3 or less without paying their mana cost and as though they had flash. This means that not only are creatures that cost 3 or less free, either player can play them at the same time that they could in instant. While this symmetrical effect does mean your opponent is able to play whatever creatures they'd like, oftentimes their decks are not able to fully take advantage of Aluren. However, there are several cards which can go infinite with Aluren just by themselves. Any creature like Man of War that can bounce itself back to the hand when it enters the battlefield can be cast infinite with Aluren. This will allow you infinite enters the battlefield and leaves the battlefield effects, as well as infinite number of spells cast in case you happen to have a card with Storm. One common combo with the card is to use Parasitic Strix, which can make an opponent lose 2 life, and you gain 2 life as long as you control a black permanent when it enters the battlefield. The black permanent you'll often use is Cavern Harpy, which lets you return a blue or black creature to its owner's hand when it enters the battlefield. You'll also be able to pay 1 life to return Cavern Harpy itself to its owner's hand. Thanks to Aluren, these 2 birds can keep coming out, and Cavern Harpy can keep returning them both, since you'll always gain more life than you pay, and eventually your opponent will run out of life. Since Squee the Immortal can be cast from the graveyard or even exile, you can keep casting him and sacrificing him to cards like Goblin Bombardment via Aluren as well. One of the most recent cards to combo with Aluren is Acerak the Archlich. The card has a powerful effect and stats for its low mana value, but requires you to have completed the Tomb of Annihilation dungeon before it can stay on the battlefield. If you haven't done so, it will return to its owner's hand as it enters the battlefield and allow you to venture into a dungeon instead. While the intent was for you to complete Tomb of Annihilation with the venture triggers he provides to eventually cast him, with Aluren you could instead choose to venture into any other dungeon as much as you wanted. Technically, this can go infinite, if only because thanks to the layout of the dungeons, your opponent will die eventually through you going through their abilities, since many room dungeons have abilities that drain life or deal direct damage. Aluren is a card only legal in Vintage, Legacy, and Commander, and is one that generally would not be printed by today's standards given the chaotic game state it causes. But even beyond the chaos, Aluren's ability works so well with creatures that return themselves or other cards to the hand that it doesn't take much at all to combo with it, to a point where it's a card almost entirely used for combos, despite having decent value and more straightforward play as well. The card is simply so effective at comboing that there's really not much reason to do anything else with it at all. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos similar to this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.